Hello together and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another conversation with Christoffer Døhlen from Norway, as we have done regularly in the past. And in our last video where Christoffer and I talked about the philosophy of antinatalism, in the end we mentioned that we might want to have a conversation about this doctrine of original sin. And so this is the topic that we will want to discuss today. And it will probably be the case that we have a differing understanding of this idea or of this model or doctrine, or however you want to call it. And therefore we shall try to examine both of our positions and try to maybe present different views on how this idea can be understood. So if you want, Christoffer, you can start by presenting how you understand this doctrine, maybe in a short form, and then we will take it from there.
Thank you very much, Amos. Right, so as many in the audience probably know, original sin is a very important doctrine in Christianity. It's a Christian dogma. And the idea is this, that originally the first human beings, Adam and Eve, were created by God in a state of holiness and justice and innocence and immortality. So then there were no pain, there were no suffering, there were no real problems with human beings, as we would call it today. They lived they had a harmony between their reason and their appetites and emotions. There was a harmonious relationship between their soul and the body. It was not like they were addicted to anything bad. They had this harmonious structure within themselves due to the grace of God, and they had this original holiness and justice. So they were perfect human beings, you could say, in a sense. But then, due to what is called the fall of man, Adam and Eve sinned, and thereby they rejected that grace and justice and holiness that God had given them, and thereby you have this fall of man, where their human nature collapsed into this sinful state, what is called original sin. And the original sin state is therefore a situation where our human existence is internally in conflict. Our soul has not an harmonious relationship with our body. We have a tendency to commit immoral things. We have a tendency to become addicted for some things, that we become slaves to our own passions and not properly ordered desires. We have this tendency of doing bad things, and we don't have this grace of holiness and justice that the original human beings had. And also one lost their immortality. So because of original sin, the fall of man, they were now able to die. They become mortal human beings, and they were now subject to pain and suffering and sickness, etc. And then this original sin got propagated, as it's called, that it was transferred to human beings after them. So everyone who is born after Adam and Eve, with them as their ancestors, thereby have this original sin, except for Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary, according to Christian doctrine. So to put it very simply then, original sin is this state of human beings where we are mortal, we are able to die, we have pain and suffering that we are subject to, and our soul and body are not in perfect harmony. We have this tendency to sin, we have improperly ordered desires, we are to some degree subject to our passions, and we don't have this perfectly virtuous existence, to put it that way. So I hope that was a good explanation of the original sin.
Yes, I think that was a good introduction of your understanding of this doctrine. Now, the way I tend to understand this, I don't know what to call it exactly. I think it's like a story or a model or a, let's call it a doctrine. How I understand this doctrine or this story of original sin is because, as we have found out in different videos in the past, I tend to view the world like a materialist. So what I think is that this story tries to explain, is an attempt to explain to human beings some aspects of their existence which seem to be very peculiar to human beings, which we don't seem to share with any other living creature. So, and I think, I'm in part influenced here by Jordan Peterson and his introduction to the biblical series. And the way I understand it is that this story of original sin basically tells the story of how human beings developed or evolved from unconscious animals to animals that have a consciousness, because as far as we know, human beings are the only animals who have a conscious awareness. Many or all of the other animals seem to just follow instincts and basically react to pleasure and pain. They seem to kind of live always in the moment. That's why, for example, a zebra can be relaxed and eating grass 50 meters away from a group of lions, because as long as the lions are not hunting the zebra, then the zebra is not afraid. And in that sense, these animals spend at least the largest part of their life very peacefully and in a state of harmony, because they don't really think about what they should do in the future, or they don't have these conflicts between different thoughts, because it just is just a subconscious balance between different drives or different emotions, and then just one of them takes the upper hand, and then that's the state of this animal. And so I think that the story of the original sin has to do with the evolution of consciousness, and that's also why I think it's somehow related to what we have discussed last time, where we said that anti-natalists believe it's false, or there shouldn't be any conscious life on the planet. So that wasn't as good an introduction as you did, but it's I think the most important aspect, at least, of my thinking.
Right. So if I understand your view, it would be said that original sin refers to the phenomena of mature conscience existence that distinguishes human beings from animals.
Yes. Yes, and this fact that human beings have the capacity to consciously decide for one thing or for another thing leads then to all kind of further effects. And so one of these effects is that human beings are, in some sense, the only creature who is capable of doing evil, because they can consciously decide to do things which they know will be bad, but they still can decide to do them. Or they can, maybe better phrase, they can decide to act against their nature, which an animal really can't do. It just acts according to its nature by default.
Right, yeah. So I suppose I would say that original sin it's a human characteristic, But we can also say that the effects of original sin, or perhaps it's more precise to say the effects of the fall of man, can also be said that we see these effects in animals, because even though animals don't have this deliberate conscience experience or reality that we have, still you could say that they do sometimes things that are perhaps improper to their nature, that they are subject to their passions and desires, and do things that aren't necessarily productive for their species. But as you have alluded to, this wouldn't be a moral failing, because animals are simply driven by instincts. But with human beings, we have this capacity to make moral choices. We are moral creatures. So original sin would therefore be connected to our moral choices. So therefore, I suppose we could say therefore that animals don't have original sin. It's a human characteristic, but you could argue that we see similar effects like original sin, though not the moral effects in a sense.
Do you have some example of these effects?
Well, I know that there are some animals who are doing some things that are that we would say are very cruel in a sense. For instance, you have some animals, I'm not quite sure which, but there are some animals where the mothers sometimes eats her own children. I'm not sure of the reason, but there are some animals in the wild that are doing that. Or one can also point to animals who commit sexual acts with others of the same sex instead of the other sex to reproduce. And this is not something that I have thought a lot about, but perhaps it might be said that those animals are doing things that aren't necessarily good according to their nature or to their species, but they are still doing it for one reason or another, not because they have an immoral choice made, because they don't have this free will, but still it is something unnatural or improper with the way they behave.
Interesting. Okay. Yes. Okay. That's an interesting side note there. I was wondering before if, in your understanding of original sin, would human beings, since they were human beings and they were perfect before the fall, would they have been able to make conscious decisions even before the fall, or not?
Yes, they would have been able to do so, absolutely.
Okay, so I guess then that would be a distinction in our understanding now. I did wonder before, I have always wondered about this when I looked at this story from a purely religious point of view. It seemed to me that there is some logical problem in it, because if these human beings were perfect in the sense that they had no bad tendencies or bad desires, and if God is also perfect in the sense that he is only good, then how could it even have happened in the first place that this fall did occur?
Right. So in other words, why did the fall occur if God is good and created a good world, if I understand the question?
Yes, yes.
Right. Yes, so the idea would be that God, he created a good world and he wants good to happen, but he allowed human beings, Adam and Eve specifically, to have the possibility of rejecting that original state of goodness that they were in, because God, in his infinite wisdom, intended to think that if they did such a thing, and that actually happened, he could be able to bring good out of it. And in the Christian perspective, we would say that God let the fall of man happen and all the sins and evil happen because that was a necessary presupposition for the things that Jesus Christ did, that they came into the world. He died for the sins of humanity, and he rose from the dead, and he were able to bring human beings out of that slavery of sin and into becoming children of God. So you could say that God let such an evil happen because he would bring good out of it, which is the redemption that is brought about by Jesus Christ. So it's related to the general answer to the general problem of evil, that God allows such things to happen because he would bring good out of it.
So then, if I understand you or paraphrase you correctly, that would mean that the state of affairs that happened in the world after the fall of man was actually in the sum total better than if Adam and Eve had just stayed in paradise and everything had remained perfect.
Well, it wouldn't be said that it was necessary to tolerate that in order to bring about more goods that God couldn't have brought about otherwise, but rather that he allowed it because it was a very good way to manifest the power or glory or greatness of God through the redemption of Christ. So he could have alternatively chosen otherwise, and let's say that he created Adam and Eve in heaven automatically and never had that problem in the first place. And he wouldn't have lacked any goodness that he could only acquire through the fall of man, but he let it happen anyway because that was a way to manifest his goodness in a beautiful way or a great way, in a sense. I suppose that could be the theological answer.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have to admit that it doesn't fully convince me. And also the other question still is, if Adam and Eve were created perfectly, then why did they fall for this? Why did they do what they were supposed not to do? If they were perfect, then I would assume that they would just have not eaten from this tree and remained in their perfect state.
Right, yes. So they would, it would be said that when they chose to do that evil, it was not because they had any strong desire that they struggled with to do it. It was a purely, it was a choice that had no context to it in the sense that we would sin today because of original sin. So it would be said that yes, they were created in a perfect state in a sense. It not in the complete, the maximal perfection that the saints in heaven are having, because then one would say that they would receive a beatific vision and see God face to face, and thereby they would never have sinned. So that's sort of the ultimate supreme perfection of man. But Adam and Eve were created in, you could say, a lower state of perfection, where they were created with the gifts of holiness and justice and the ability to carry that on. But God let them have this possibility of sinning. Perhaps, as you could say, it's a way of testing or probation to see what the human beings would do if they were created in a good state, and see if they would carry on or not. And if they carried on, then they would receive the supreme perfection in heaven, or if not, otherwise. So it might perhaps be a complicated way to understand it, but that's at least the best answer I can think of right in the moment.
Sure, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but still, for me, this is a problem which prevented me for a long time to take this story seriously, or to see any value in it, because I just thought it's there's a logical contradiction in it, and I still think so, because of these two questions that I have just asked you now. But I think that that one of the values of having this mythology and believing it as a part of your religion is that people who take this story seriously should actually believe that they themselves are capable of doing bad things, of doing sins against oneself and against other people. And I think that's a very uncomfortable fact that is very important that people would recognize. And I think many people today absolutely reject this fact. They believe we are very sophisticated and we are a very advanced society, and so we are basically only good. That's like when we had some history in high school and we talked about these horrible things that the Nazis did, then some people's reaction was, how could they have done this? I would never have done this. And Peterson would ask there, well, are you so sure? How do you know that you wouldn't have done this? Because there is plenty of evidence that human beings do all kinds of horrible things. And so I think that's one very important advantage of this doctrine, is it should make people more aware that they themselves are capable of doing evil.
Yes, exactly. I would say that we can see testimony of original sin in reality. We see both by looking at history and looking at our everyday lives and people in general and our own personal experience, that we have this capacity for evil and also the tendency to do things that we realize are not actually good but immoral. How many people who perhaps do evils that are not great in a sense that they commit murder or something like that, but it could be lying or cheating or being a parent and you don't take the best care of your children, you neglect them to a certain degree. People who are partying all night and know that no, they shouldn't really be doing that. It's not good for their health and it's not good for their soul, but they're still doing it. So perhaps you could call that the so-called everyday evils that people commit all the time, and they realize that it's not actually what I should be doing, but I have this tendency to do these things because of these inordinate passions that I have. And yeah, I think that's a phenomenon that also the non-Christian thinkers like Plato and Aristotle would also completely agree to that. Yes, of course, we are regularly not virtuous. Virtue is an ideal that we see lacks of all around us. I think that's sort of a fact that everyone agrees that in other words, as I would say, we have testimony of original sin all around us. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree, and I think that is a useful way of thinking about this doctrine, no matter some of the problems that we have discussed a little bit before, what you believe there, but you can certainly observe that people in the world everywhere have sometimes, as you said, a capacity and a tendency to do evil things. And even if I just observe my own thoughts, there are regularly occasions where I know that something by my own definition is bad, that I shouldn't do this, but still I feel that I would want to do it. Or that something by my own standards I know would be now good or the right thing to do, but still I feel that I don't want to do it. So, for example, I don't know, if I have some stupid argument with my wife about something which is really not very important, and it's kind of like a proxy argument. So we are arguing about, why didn't you put your dishes into the dishwasher? But in fact, there is some other problem. but then when I'm kind of angry, then I know that the dishwasher is not the real problem, and I should just let it go and try to communicate in a good way and find out what the real problem is. But then I have this anger, and I feel like, no, but I'm angry and I want to now do whatever. So this is very, very common. I think everybody knows personal experiences where he knows what is the good, but he has some part in him which wants to do the other thing. And as you mentioned, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, I also wanted to mention Socrates, because Socrates said that he has his demon, and he is wiser than other men only because when his demon tells him not to do something, then he doesn't do it. And I think what the Socrates demon is kind of the equivalent to what religious people call the voice of God, or what secular people might call intuition, or their gut feeling, or something like that. Sometimes you just have an intuition or a gut feeling that you shouldn't do something. Or maybe you might even say, like, you kind of, it's like you hear this voice in the back of your head which says, no, this is not a good idea. And then you should listen to that. But oftentimes you are, how do you say, you have this desire to still do it.
Right, that's very true. And I would say this is a testimony of what St. Paul writes in his famous letter to the Romans, that the law is written on our hearts, that we have this capacity to distinguish right from wrong, and we can understand goodness and evil and apply that to concrete things in our life. And therefore we see that we have some possibility of doing something that is bad, and we know that it's not really good, that which I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway because of this desire or passion that is inordinate. And yes, I think that's what people in general would call, perhaps some would call the voice of God, but also I would say it's the law written on our hearts, which St. Paul says. It's interesting about that demon that Socrates said that it has. I haven't heard about that before. Do you know where the source of that information is from? Is one of Plato's dialogues, perhaps?
I can't tell you where the source is. I think I've learned it from Jordan Peterson. But I guess if you would Google it, you would find it.
Right. Well, if it is a demon that is sort of whispering in his ear, then I suppose that would be more of the voice trying to convince him to do bad things, because demons are evil and angels are those who would try to convince them to do the good. And that's also, I can mention, a Christian belief that the devil actually exists as a real figure in the world, and he tempts people to commit evil, and unfortunately is successful a lot of the time. So I could also mention that. So yes, that's interesting, where you see this similarities between what Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle would say, and what later theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine would say about a very similar or the same matter.
Yes, I was thinking that also one way that this idea has been expressed in I think in Christian doctrine, and also it's kind of generally accepted in our culture, is this idea that human beings have a conscience, that your conscience tells you what is right and what is wrong, and you cannot voluntarily control whether you have a bad conscience about something, because it's not up to you. It's somehow, I think, the same idea that the law is written on your hearts. You cannot just decide what the law is, but the true law is somehow fixed, maybe based on human nature. And so I think that's interesting. And also there was some Christian theologian, I'm not sure which one it was, who equated the conscience with the voice of God. So all these ideas kind of hang together. Yes, so also just a quick idea about Socrates' demon. Perhaps he was using the word to mean something different from what we understand today when we talk about demons, or what kind of, because it would be difficult for me to define what a demon is, but what kind of, we assume that the general meaning of the term demon is. So that was just a thought, because you said then the demon would tempt him to do evil things, but I think he wasn't talking about this concept.
Okay, well, perhaps he might have been talking about some supernatural figure or creature that has later been translated as demon, but perhaps that's an imprecise translation. I don't know, but perhaps
that would be one possibility how this could happen. Yes.
Right. Yes. Yeah, because in Christianity, a demon is very strictly defined as a fallen angel that is cooperating with Satan and bringing human beings down to damnation. So it would always be a bad thing in Christian doctrine. Also, one thing I would say about original sin is that we can also see how this has interesting social and political implications. I realized that a lot of political philosophies have a specific anthropological principle or premise behind it. If you think that human beings are good and that you sort of trust man as such to do great things, then you would perhaps be more of a liberal and a progressive who would think that no, we shouldn't have social norms to restrict human beings. We should let them do whatever they want, and we'll have massive creativity and in inventing great things and doing great things. Perhaps we'll have people on Mars just as soon as we get a fantastic liberal technological society. But if you have this original sin doctrine, then you would, it's natural to conclude that you need a society with strong social norms to watch out for man, to make sure that man doesn't go exceed his boundaries, that he is sort of taken care of by social norms and hierarchies and structures. That's what thinkers like the French-speaking author Joseph de Maistre would say, a very brilliant writer in the late 18th and early 19th century, who had a very dark and pessimistic view of human nature. He once said that man, if left to himself, is too wicked to be free. And he would argue, it seems that for him, strong hierarchies and social norms and having strong families which raise children to learn good virtues, that is very necessary to avoid people becoming wild, essentially. And have strict rules and norms to watch out that people doesn't abuse their own nature because of this original sin, because of the tendency to be wicked. So I see that we can have, there are different social or political philosophies that have different anthropological principles behind them.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up there, that which way you want society to be structured has very much to do with your anthropology or your view of what human nature is. And also, I think the opposition that you have created here is, or that you have explained, is very interesting. The difference between the liberal doctrine, where people are essentially good, and I guess probably Rousseau is one of the very influential thinkers in this category, because just before the French Revolution was the time when Rousseau lived and wrote, and he basically, his theory of the world and of human beings was that human beings are by nature good, but then society corrupts them. And so if you would remove the social forces, then they would kind of be good by themselves. And here again, I would like to quote Jordan Peterson, because I think he is way more sophisticated in this question than most other thinkers that I have heard on the matter, because Jordan Peterson says that he believes half in Rousseau and half in Thomas Hobbes, which basically said that man is only wicked and evil. And so what Peterson would say is that man is both good and evil. He has equal parts of both tendencies in him. And I think this is a very, to me, a very convincing way to view the world, because if you say that man is only evil, then you cannot, for example, explain why people, like many people in history, but for example, like you and me, would spend a lot of energy to try to find out what is actually the good and how can I do the good and how can I avoid doing evil and so on. Because if everyone was only evil, then nobody would even care to be good. But on the other hand side, if you think that people are only good, then you just have to take a look around in the world and see that this theory doesn't work either. And so I guess in the end, there is a balance between good and evil in each human individual. And therefore, we also need a balance between having strict norms that kind of hold people back from doing evil, but at the same time giving them the freedom to also do some things which are not all prescribed and predicted by the social norms.
Right, yes, interesting. Yeah, there are multiple things I could say there. On the last point, yes, to have some liberty, at least from some higher institutions, is something I think most people would agree to. But there would be this understanding of subsidiarity, that you have the individual, and then you have the family, and then you have the small community, you have the church, you have teachers, and then you have the state or the king and the pope, etc. So there would be this understanding, according to many conservatives. I think also Joseph de Maistre would agree to this to a certain degree, that you have these different social groups and it shouldn't interfere with these other groups when they can do this by their own. But he would be against this individualism, that the individual is sort of needs to have this huge space from everything around him. Rather, the individual would have his place, but it would be within the family or the church or something like that. So you could therefore say that there would be strong social norms, but they would be distributed among multiple institutions. So yes, we have talked about this before, but I think that's an important point. Yes, also one thing that is interesting to consider, that when you talked about Rousseau and his theory of how man became corrupt, according to him, that was a civilization. And when man first created private property, stuff like that, was what he talked about. And there are also many other stories and accounts that people and different mythologies have that tries to account for why is there evil and suffering in the world. And it seems to be this general tendency and pattern that many groups and individuals and different mythologies always had this original good human existence, and then it became corrupt. But they have these variations. Rousseau would say it was society that made man corrupt, and others would perhaps say something else. But according to the Christian view, it could be said that all of these different tendencies of viewing human existence as something originally good and then became bad could be understood as a testimony to the real truth, that is that man was actually good in Adam and Eve, and then you had the fall of man, and then this story has been passed on from generation to generation. And as we know, when stories get passed on over a very long time, then they get changed a little bit here and there, and you have these different variations. So that would be an interesting explanation from the Christian perspective, which I could mention there. Also, one thing about the severity of original sin I also could mention is that if you also look at the Christian account, you see that as soon as the fall of man happens, we see severe evil. It's not like people just became a little bit corrupt and then it increased over time, but it seems like it was already very problematic from the beginning. The children of Adam and Eve, so we already have the second generation of humanity. You have Cain killing his own brother, and that's happening very, very soon after the fall of man. So that would be an interesting thing to consider, that original sin is so strong that even just the next generation from the first human beings ever, you have a scenario where a person kills his own brother due to envy. So that could also be a witness of how strong and tragic original sin is. So I would also mention that. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think these stories were not meant to be taken lightly. So the idea is that through this story of original sin, we can explain why people are as evil as they actually are. And if you look around you, then you see, yes, they are plenty evil sometimes. So I think that's true. I think also your observation that many different stories kind of start similarly in a kind of a good state, and then through some mechanism or other explain why this good state was lost. I think it's also a useful observation, and to me, I have no objections to it, because as I said, I understand this original state to be kind of in our evolutionary past before this faculty of conscious awareness kind of evolved. And I think up to date, there is no real theory among biologists or evolutionary biologists how this actually happens. They can't yet explain it with some nice theory, but still, I think, yeah, for me, that doesn't mean that this is not how it happened. It just means that we still cannot explain it. So I had some other thought, but I forgot it. So maybe if you want to say something to that.
Yes, I can also briefly clarify, just in case in the audience perhaps misunderstood, that when different accounts for how man got corrupt, I just want to make sure that I believe that the creation account in Genesis, in scripture, about Adam and Eve and the fall of man, that is absolutely true. So I would not count that as mythology, but these other religious accounts as mythology, just in case anyone misunderstood that. So I would sort of see those different accounts from the world to be testimonies to the true account, which is the fall of man, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and etc. Yes, there was another aspect of the fall of man and original sin, which I also would like to mention, which is also an important part of it, but perhaps is ignored or neglected sometimes from the Christian perspective, is also that pain, suffering, and death followed the fall of man. That us being subject to disease like cancer or any kind of disease that people might be born with, genetic problems that make them have bothersome problems in their lives. From the Christian perspective, that will also be a result of the fall of man. So there would be some difference between the Christian account and, for instance, evolutionary accounts, because we would say that disease and suffering and pain is not actually the original state of man, but something that came after the fall, including also the death that people are subject to. And also we would also see, based on this, it would be seen when we see human beings or humanity, mankind, through time, we sort of see a worsening of man. Though when it comes to immoral actions, as I said, we see already evil from Cain and Abel and onwards. And of course, Adam and Eve started it all. But we would say that we can see an increasing amount of different genetic failings and diseases and mutation, etc. That, in other words, humanity is becoming degenerated. And that's a very interesting remark that is some people have talked about, that you can actually see human society in some ways are degenerating, actually worsening over time, because, for instance, mutations, genetic mutations is something that is sometimes created when you create a new human being. And then these mutations accumulate, and these mutations are often bad for human beings. They create diseases and problems of different sorts. And then you accumulate that over time, and human beings are actually getting worse and worse when it comes to their bodily health. And also some people would point to, for instance, our language is getting worse over time. That actually, if you look at the ancient language like Latin and all the Greek, etc., they would be more sophisticated and structural and systematic and intelligent languages. But language spoken today is actually worse. It's less sophisticated and actually, to put it that way, more degenerated. So that's also a point that I would want to bring up, which is very relevant to the Christian understanding of the fall of man and original sin.
I would have a couple of things to say to that. So maybe starting with this idea that pain and suffering and death came into existence through the fall of man or through original sin. So the way I would understand this in my understanding of this doctrine is that before human beings, let's just say, had conscious awareness of their existence and their surrounding, then in some sense, pain kind of exists sometimes in the moment, but suffering and death and disease kind of don't exist, because to be afraid of death means you have to have a conscious awareness that your life will end at some time in the future. Other than that, there are just basically 3 or 4 states that you can be in. You can either be happy because you are right now eating some good meal, or maybe having sex, or you are satisfied after you have done so, or you are kind of unhappy because you have a certain craving that you cannot fulfill at the moment, or you are dead, in which case you don't experience anything, and therefore these concepts in some sense don't exist if you don't have a conscious awareness. Because if you take the evolutionary point of view, of course, diseases and pain and death existed before human beings existed, or even before any animals on outside of the oceans existed. But if you are not conscious, then in some sense they don't exist. And I happen to think that these religious explanations of the world, they are all kind of written from the first person perspective, which is very unusual for modern people, because we are drilled into this scientific worldview where all the subjective experience is filtered out and you only look at the objective facts. So at these facts, which is both true for me and for you and for everybody else. Like I can say, for example, this pen here is blue. But if you take a worldview from the first person perspective, then if I am not conscious that I'm going to die, then death doesn't exist. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I haven't heard that consideration before. Well, I would sort of say that human beings have these experiences, and of course it's very true that you cannot experience your own death. Now, from a Christian perspective, the soul lives on after death, so you will experience having died, but the moment of death is the transition from being on earth to the next life. But I would still say that when it comes to experience, the object of our experience is still reality. For instance, it would always be experience of death in the sense that you know that other people around you die, that you have members of your family who pass away. So you could say that even though, even from your point of view, we wouldn't experience our own death, we would still experience the death of other human beings. So we would still recognize these features of being part of reality. It would always, in other words, be the object of our experience always. What do you think of this?
That's interesting. So even though if I do not experience my own death, then I would experience, for example, that some of my friends or of my parents or relatives will at some point stop being alive. And even if I have no conscious awareness, I will, in some sense, take this in as a fact of reality. And I guess that is true, but still, I guess if I don't have any conscious awareness, then I wouldn't kind of be able to reflect on it. And I certainly wouldn't then be able to draw the conclusion that the same thing is going to happen to me in the future. So I would just kind of maybe feel some wonder or some amazement that something which used to be a constant in my life, namely this other person, now all of a sudden has ceased to exist. And I kind of see the corpse and I realize that it's no longer the same thing, but then I just move on like an animal does and continue eating and running away from predators or hunting prey and reproducing myself and sleeping, and that's it. So in some sense, still death as it exists for humans doesn't exist without consciousness.
So if I understand your view correctly, you would say that yes, all these features are there for animals, but when some of these animals, or one of them, evolved into human beings and thereby gained consciousness, then he began reflecting upon these features and thereby from that point onwards understood death and suffering as real features of the world.
Yes, and also specifically as real features of the world from his first person experience, from his first person perspective. They kind of came into existence when he was conscious to think about them.
But in that scenario, it would still be the case that they would realize more abstractly what is happening around them, but they wouldn't conclude from that directly that therefore these features began to exist and didn't exist beforehand. They would just now discover them in a sense. But to discover something is not the same as concluding that from now on it began to exist.
Yes, I would also, of course, add that this was a long process. This didn't happen like in some instant. So the evolution of consciousness was probably a process that took many, many generations of individuals kind of changing in this way to develop consciousness. And in that sense, also these realities or these facts kind of came into existence from the perspective of a conscious being gradually over time. So for some animal who just has a slight hint of sometimes having some conscious moment and then drifting away into unconsciousness again for a long time, there would just be like a small amount of existence basically, and then as you evolve like more towards a human being, it would exist more permanently, the idea of death, for example. But I think that this story of Adam and Eve summarizes this whole development just in one step.
Well, I would disagree with the notion that consciousness can evolve. But if we leave that subject aside, still, conscious experiences are something that individuals have. So even from the point of view of it being gradual over a long period of time, there would be one moment, the first moment, where one individual finally came to the conclusion that death exists in the world at one point or another. Then that thought came up. But for that individual, he would still know that the environment from in which he grew and was raised from being a small baby and then became an adult, he would still know that after his realization that these features has followed him all the way from his birth. He has seen death and suffering around him. So even in this gradualistic account, we don't find an explanation for why they supposedly would say that it began to exist, if you understand my point.
Yes, I understand your point. So if I would summarize it, you would say that the first time that a person has realized that death exists, he would think not that it has come into existence through his realization, but that it was there all along for all of the past.
Yes.
I guess that's true if you think from an objective scientific, or if you think from an objective point of view. But if you think from a strictly subjective point of view, then you could still say that for an unconscious person, death still doesn't exist. Whereas for me, who is conscious, it does exist.
Yeah, I think I understood your distinction, but even from the first person subjective point of view, death would be a true part of reality for him, in that now he discovers it. But still, that wouldn't, at least not necessarily, mean that he concludes that from now on it began to exist for him. Perhaps an analogy could be a scientist who discovers a new planet. From that scientist's point of view subjectively, now this planet would be a part of his perceived reality, but he would never conclude that it began to exist from the moment that I discovered it. Or else you fall into this philosophy of George Berkeley, I think his philosophy was that things began to exist only by people looking at them. Some form of idealism, very strange philosophy, but yeah.
Yes. I know that it's strange, but still I think it seems so strange to us because we are so accustomed and trained to view the world from the third person perspective, from things that are intersubjectively verifiable, like this planet. I can look at the planet and you can look at the planet. And even if I stop looking at the planet, you can still look at the planet and it still exists. So this is the third person point of view, but you could say, for example, before anybody knew about the coronavirus, in these individual people's lives, the fear of the coronavirus didn't exist. Of course, the individual virus, the biological things did exist. That's the scientific perspective. But from the first person perspective, things that I don't know about, they kind of don't exist for me. And I think that sometimes these religious worldviews, they make sense if you look at them as coming from the first person perspective, and they have all kinds of logical contradictions if you try to understand them from the scientific perspective.
Well, I have two questions or comments then, I would say. The first one would be that even from the subjective experience, you have this individual, he concludes that death really exists, and then he looks around himself and he sees all the evidence for death having been present, and perhaps he reflects upon his own past, etc. It still seems to me from the subjective experience of from himself, if he concludes anything about when death began to exist at all, perhaps you could argue that his consciousness is so primitive, even though I don't believe that would be true. But if we, for the sake of the argument, that was the case, that he concluded that in some intermediary state of evolving consciousness, perhaps he just concludes that death exists, but does not conclude whether it has existed before or not. He simply says that now it exists, and he doesn't say anymore or think anymore about it. But from the moment that the person begins to reflect upon the question of, is death something new or has it always existed? From the moment he considers that thought, it seems to me that the only conclusion he would get is that, yes, death has always existed. It has existed all around me, and I see all this evidence for it. So from his subjective experience, from the moment he considers that question, it still seems to me that from his perspective, he would conclude that it has existed before. And also my other question or comment, which you can answer, even if the scenario would happen in the way you speculated, still the generations afterward wouldn't copy that view, because let's say you have the first individual who concludes death exists, and then he sort of tells that to his children. They would have therefore the information received from the parents that death exists. So from their point of view, they would have received information about reality that they got from somebody else. So for the new people after them, for them, death would be something in the past, in a sense, if you understand my point. Yeah.
I do, but I can't explain my point any better than I already have. I think I will just keep repeating myself, because even for this new generation who has learned from their parents, still when they look at the zebra, they see that the zebra is eating grass right next to the lion and it's not afraid of death. So for the zebra, still death doesn't exist in its experience. And in the experience of human beings, it only exists because we are fundamentally different than all the other animals, because we have a consciousness. So even if I understand now with my consciousness that death exists and it has always existed in the world, this realization, this experience only began when consciousness began. And so from the point of view of my experience, without consciousness, death wouldn't exist.
Right. Yes, I think, but I still don't see how from that it follows that they would conclude that death began to exist. Perhaps you could say that it's technically possible they would conclude that, but it's not, at least not necessarily the case they would still conclude that.
Well, it is necessarily the case if you assume that they had this other worldview, that it was not this scientific objective worldview, but it was only the worldview from my own experience.
Only the subjective worldview from my experience, but does that mean that they would conclude that as an objective fact?
There isn't really an objective fact, such a thing like an objective fact in the point of view of my subjective experience. It's just I experience things.
Right, but they could make conclusions about how the world works based on those experiences.
Yes, but as soon as you start eliminating the individual experience, then you are doing what we are used to doing today, which is only looking at the objective facts, as we call them.
Yes, but I wouldn't sort of see a separation there in that sense. I would say that the subjective experience would still be about reality, and it will always have access to some part of reality. And whatever thought that is derived from that experience won't necessarily be a thought about reality, because you could say it's philosophically impossible to have a thought about anything that is not real, in a sense, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I think we're not really getting any further with it, so I don't know how to continue from here.
Yeah, this is perhaps something we can return to another time, or some related issue. It seems like we have been talking for an hour, I think. So
yes, a bit more probably.
Right. So it's up to you, but do you think we should sum it up, or is there any related question we should touch upon before we end, or what do you think?
I think we have left some open ends. We didn't really get to the bottom. We can try to sum it up, and then perhaps I will just see how I will use the video and what parts will be useful and what parts will be kind of repetitive.
Yes, right. Would you begin, or should I begin to sum up? Or?
If you want to, you can begin.
Right. Yes. So, yeah, our last discussion is something that hasn't gone to a conclusion, but we have still made some good points and considerations that are important today, and we realize, both of us, that we see all around us that human beings have this tendency to do evil, that they have these passions that they follow, and that they do things that they know aren't the best, that they know that they shouldn't be doing that, but they're still doing it. And we see sort of everyday evils around us, and we know horrendous evils have been done in the past and also today. And this, from the Christian perspective, would call original sin. and has occurred after the fall of man. So that would be explained in that sense. But even people who doesn't accept the Christian view of original sin, many of them would still admit that, yes, we see this problem of humanity, of tendency to doing bad things. And also that informs our political perspectives and social perspectives. So we see the centrality of this issue in society, in our lives, in our personal lives. So I think this is a very good question to consider and to discuss, even though we wouldn't agree on how we understand original sin. Yeah, perhaps this is something we can have a conversation about in another video about those disagreements. But yes, I think we made some good points here, and I hope the audience learned something new and had some thoughts that they might think more about. So I thank you, Amos, for having me on in this video to talk about these issues, and I wish you and the audience a great Thursday.
Great, thank you very much for being on. I would just add to your summary. I think one also important point that you have brought up was that the anthropology is central to the political philosophy. So the way you view human nature is very central to your ideas about how society should be organized. And you have brought up this difference between the liberal point of view, which is basically you should let people as much freedom as possible, and then they will do as much good as possible because they are fundamentally good. And this other point of view that you should restrict people's freedom through social norms quite severely, because else they will do a lot of evil. And I think one point that we would, or that I think we should at some time go into a bit further, is how to determine the right balance between these two points of view. Because as I happen to think, there is both good and evil in man, and therefore we need to find a balance between restrictions and leaving people also freedom. And I think generally this topic about where does the good come from if people are fallen through original sin and are basically evil, then where does the good come from in the world? This might also be an interesting topic for another discussion.
Yes, the origin of goodness is also a very good subject that we should touch upon one day.
Yes, so I think that's a good conclusion. I thank you for being on, and then I wish you and the audience a great day.
Thank you very much. Same to you and the audience. So yeah.
So see you soon.
See you soon. Goodbye.